Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that looks tidy on the surface and absolutely unhinged underneath. Victorian family life under church rules. Not the cosy Christmas card version with carol singers and snow, but the real deal where your schedule, your clothes, your friendships, your bedtime, your bedroom, and possibly your chair were all technically God's business. Before we drift too far into heresy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And thank you for suggesting this topic. It was a delightful rabbit hole to fall into. If you're feeling bold, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Odds are it's long past the hour when a respectable Victorian would already be in bed, repenting for the day's more questionable thoughts. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, just in case a judgmental Victorian grandmother appears at the foot of your bed. So let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if your entire life was one long performance review, conducted by your local vicar and 12 very nosy neighbours? What if your choice of hat could be interpreted as a spiritual crisis? Would your Sunday habits pass inspection, or would you be quietly downgraded to back pew energy? Could you survive a world where holding hands before marriage was basically a prequel to eternal damnation, where your kids memorise Bible verses for fun, and where even reading the wrong novel could get you labelled troublingly worldly? Would you last a week in a house where every argument, outfit and dinner was evaluated on a scale from edifying to probably from Satan? Because congratulations, you've just woken up in a respectable little Victorian town sometime around 1873. You're wearing too much wool, your parents are worried about your soul, and the church doesn't just shape your Sundays, it runs your entire life. This story will follow the same sleepy, sarcastic style you've heard in earlier episodes. Your day doesn't start with a gentle phone alarm and a quick doom scroll. It starts with the church bell screaming into the morning like God's own notification system. You jolt awake in a cold bedroom that smells faintly of coal dust and damp fabric, blinking at the pale light seeping around heavy curtains. Before you're even properly conscious, that bell is already reminding you of two things. One, you're late, and two, God is watching. The rhythm of your town is set not by personal preference, but by that tower of stone and judgment at the end of the street. Work hours, school times, Sunday services, funerals, weddings. If it matters, the bell announces it. You don't need a calendar. You have guilt with acoustics. As you drag yourself out of bed, you already know that whether today counts as faithful or slipping will depend on how often you fall in line with that sound. The bell rings with such self-confidence that you wonder if it knows something you don't. Like the exact tally of how many times you've overslept this month. Its voice cuts through the quiet of the house, echoing off plaster walls and wooden floors, vibrating the loose window pane your father keeps meaning to fix. You wrap a blanket around your shoulders, trying to convince yourself this is the kind of cold that builds character. Victorians believed that about everything. Cold air, responsibility, soup, especially soup. The mattress behind you still holds the ghost of your body heat, and leaving it feels like breaking up with the only stable relationship in your life. You shuffle across the bedroom floor, stepping around the chamber pot with the precision of someone who has made one mistake too many in the dark. The boards groan under your feet, under your, tattling on your movement like a snitching sibling. Your siblings are stirring in the other beds, though stirring might be generous. It's more like a chorus of soft complaints, sighs, sniffles, and the occasional muffled plea for 5 more minutes of sleep. The bell, of course, offers no such grace period. In Victorian England, you exist to obey two things, the clock tower and your mother's voice, and only one of them has the legal right to condemn your soul. Let's talk about the cold for a second. You pull on last night's wool clothing, which is somehow colder than the room itself, as if the fabric holds icy grudges. Your fingers fumble with buttons the size of coins. You can practically feel your joints aging 1 century per button. Victorian buttons are not a morning-friendly invention. They require dexterity, patience, and a spiritual gift for suffering. You splash water on your face, water that could legally qualify as a weapon, scooped from a basin that hasn't been warmed since last July. The shock nearly takes you out of the timeline. Modern people talk about cold plunges as if they invented misery. Victorians were forced into cold plunges daily, and nobody congratulated them for it on social media. Downstairs, the fire is still a rumour. Your father pokes at last night's embers with a sense of grim determination, as though wrestling warmth into existence is a sign of moral fortitude. The sound of his effort mixes with the bell's distant tolling, each clang saying, "Hurry up, righteous people do not loiter. Your mother is already alert," which is suspicious because the sun barely exists yet. She moves through the kitchen arranging breakfast with the calm urgency of someone who knows God could appear at any moment and judge the cleanliness of the spoons. She glances toward the window each time the bell rings, as if checking whether the neighbours are also awake. In Victorian life, punctuality isn't just polite, it's theological. You step outside to fetch coal or sweep snow from the doorstep, your designated morning chore, and the bell is still ringing, still lecturing, still reminding the whole town that salvation isn't free. The air outside bites your skin in a way that feels personal. Chimneys belch out the morning smoke of hundreds of families who also woke up too early. The street smells like soot, frozen mud, and mild resentment. The bell finally falls silent, leaving behind a ringing in your ears and a sense that you've already failed at least 3 invisible expectations. But that's the beauty of Victorian mornings. The day hasn't truly begun, and somehow you're already spiritually behind schedule. You step back inside, toes numb, face stinging, clothes stiffening in the cold, and as you stand there, in this drafty hallway, listening to the familiar clatter of your family preparing for another dutiful day, you realise something. The bell isn't just marking time, it's marking you. And the day has only just begun. Before you even smell toast, you're kneeling on the floorboards, while your father reads from a family Bible big enough to be used as a blunt weapon. Your knees hurt, your stomach growls, and your little brother is attempting silent rebellion by breathing too loudly. This is family worship, a twice-a-day ritual where your household checks in with God and, more importantly, performs piety for each other. You mumble along to familiar verses, trying to sound devout without overdoing it, because nothing is more suspicious than appearing too enthusiastic. Every cough, shuffle, or sideways glance feels like it might be logged in some celestial HR file. When the final amen comes, it's less a spiritual climax and more a release. Now you're allowed to eat, talk, and briefly pretend your eternal soul is not under constant review at least until evening prayers. The floorboards beneath your knees feel like they were specifically engineered to test your spiritual resilience. You shift your weight ever so slightly, hoping the squeak doesn't betray your discomfort. Your mother sits perfectly still, hands folded, face serene, the expression of a woman who has trained herself to ignore physical agony for the sake of holiness. Your father, meanwhile, is deep into his reading, voice steady and solemn, every sentence delivered with the gravity of a courtroom verdict. As he turns a page, the Bible creaks like it's protesting under its own weight. You wonder how many family generations have endured this exact moment, kneeling, listening, trying to focus while the smell of breakfast ingredients begins to seep in from the kitchen. If sanctification is a process, Victorian families started on empty stomachs. Your father's reading continues. It is both familiar and endless. He pauses occasionally to clear his throat in a way that suggests the entire household may have disappointed him in some subtle spiritual manner. When he reaches a particularly stern verse, usually involving wrath, judgment, or someone getting dramatically smitten, he looks up briefly, eyes sweeping across the room like a lighthouse beam searching for sin. You lower your gaze instantly. It's safer that way. Let's talk about your siblings. Your older sister kneels with the poise of a marble statue, radiating virtue so convincingly that you suspect she practices in secret. Your little brother, however, is a human tornado compressed into a child-sized Victorian outfit. His attempts at being still only make him more chaotic. One eyelid twitches, then a foot taps, then he begins tracing patterns on the floorboards with one finger, until your mother gently places her hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder that God prefers motionless children. Your stomach growls loudly enough to be classified as a minor disturbance. Everyone hears it. No one reacts. That is the rule. Acknowledging hunger during prayer is dangerously close to admitting you are human. The prayer portion begins next, which is theoretically shorter, but always feels longer. Your father prays with the tone of someone placing a customer service call to heaven to report ongoing issues within the household. You bow your head and try not to think about the tea growing cold in the next room. You attempt to pray sincerely, but your mind drifts to toast, warm butter, and the possibility that today's breakfast might include actual jam. Halfway through, your foot falls asleep. The pins and needles creep upward like an invading army. You resist the urge to move because everyone knows the worst sin during family worship is disrupting the emotional ambience. You attempt subtle wiggles, the kind that could be explained away as shifting one's spiritual posture, but it's no use. Your leg is gone. Finally, the prayer tapers off. You sense the ending before the words arrive, like a dog sensing a change in barometric pressure. When your father says amen, the whole family exhales in unison. It is not irreverence, it is survival. You stand slowly, pretending that your limbs still function, and file into the kitchen. The warm smells wrap around you like a reward for spiritual endurance. Breakfast isn't just food, it's liberation, a tiny slice of freedom before the next round of expectations begins. As you sit, as your mother pours tea, as your father folds his Bible with deliberate care, you take a moment to savour the strange peace that follows a ritual engineered to keep your soul in line. It's temporary, yes. Evening prayers are waiting for you like a meeting reminder that can't be snoozed. But for now, you're fed, you're upright, and your knees, miraculously, have survived another day of devotion. Getting dressed isn't about self-expression. It's about not giving the church ladies a heart attack. You stand in front of a tiny mirror, attempting to look respectable without looking vain, modest without looking poor, neat without looking like you tried too hard. Every choice is a theological minefield. Hemline too short, you're flirting with sin. Hemline too long. Clearly you enjoy drawing attention to your modesty, which is also suspect. Colours that are too bright suggest frivolity. Colours that are too dark suggest morbid tendencies. For women, the rule is simple: dress like an angel in the house who has never had a complicated thought. For men, you're aiming for sober, hard-working, not secretly a drunk. Even your bonnet can become a spiritual statement. By the time you're laced, buttoned, pinned, and wrapped, you're not sure if you're ready for the day or for a minor exorcism. Victorian dressing is less a routine and more a ritual sacrifice, your comfort being the sacrificed item. You begin with layers, because the Victorian era believes that the human body should be swaddled like a fragile porcelain teapot. Chemise, corset, or stays, petticoats, possibly more petticoats, stockings, boots, bodice, skirt, shawl, and then whatever decorative restraint device passes for outerwear today. You feel increasingly like a very devout onion. Every layer carries a moral message about humility, discipline, and how much trouble you intend to cause, which should always be none. The mirror, of course, is useless. It's the size of a slice of toast and distorted just enough to make you question whether your soul is also slightly crooked. You tilt your head left, then right, trying to gauge whether your hair arrangement suggests wholesome spiritual stability or secret wickedness. In this era, even a stray curl falling from a bun can be interpreted as emotional chaos. If you're wearing a corset, the morning only gets better. Lacing it involves holding the bedpost for dear life while a sibling, parent, or resigned spouse pulls the laces tight with the determination of someone closing a suitcase they overpacked by accident. It restricts your breathing enough to make modern shapewear look like a warm hug. Victorians insist it promotes good posture and a virtuous silhouette, though the real effect is that you walk around looking proud, dignified, and secretly unable to bend at the waist. And then comes colour selection. arguably the most stressful moment of the dressing ceremony. Today's choice? Muted blue or muted brown. Anything more daring requires serious soul-searching and possibly prayer. If you're a woman, floral patterns are acceptable as long as the flowers appear chaste. If you're a man, avoid flashy waistcoats unless you want people whispering that you gamble, drink, or possess an unsettling sense of individuality. Your shoes, stiff and narrow, feel like they were designed by someone who had never seen a foot but was morally opposed to them. You lace them up, realizing comfort is a sin you'll atone for later. Standing up, you do a quick spin to ensure nothing swishes too enthusiastically. Victorian clothing should never swish. It may rustle respectably, but swishing invites chaos. Once you're mostly dressed, the accessories begin circling you like judgmental satellites. Gloves. Essential, because the sight of bare hands might send the congregation into spiritual crisis. A brooch. Tasteful. Small. Something that quietly whispers, I am a respectable human being. Please don't report me. And the bonnet. Your moral crown. Tilt it too far back, and you look flirtatious. Too far forward, and you look like you're trying to hide from the Lord. You aim for the sweet spot. Earnest, tidy, slightly exhausted. For men, the process is just as fraught. Your jacket must be tailored but not stylish. Your cravat should be neat but not dandyish. Your hair must be tidy but not vain. The Victorian Church is very generous with its expectations, because it has so very many of them. Even facial hair requires balance. Too much, and you look like a revolutionary. Too little, and you look like you have something to hide. Finely dressed, you take a step back and assess yourself. A walking moral object lesson. You feel the weight of fabric, the pinch of stays, the stiffened collar, the itchy wool, all subtle reminders that holiness is uncomfortable by design. You smooth your sleeves one last time, hoping the neighbours won't notice the faint wear on the cuffs. Or worse, interpret it as a sign of financial instability. You descend the stairs, every rustle echoing through the house like a quiet announcement. The outfit has descended. Your mother gives you the traditional inspection, her eyes scanning your clothing with the efficiency of an airport security officer. A nod means you're acceptable. A frown means you're about to redo everything. Only when you pass inspection, collect your gloves, and step toward the door do you realize the truth. You're not just dressed, you're curated, ready to face the public, the pews, and most terrifyingly the church ladies. Stepping out your front door is less going for a stroll and more entering a live-action spiritual audit. The street to church is lined with the same people you see every week. Neighbours, shopkeepers, that one widowed aunt who always seems to be at her window. Everyone is walking in the same direction at the same time, like a very polite religious migration. Your family's pace, posture and punctuality are all on display. Late again? People notice. Walking too fast. Show off. Walking too slowly. Lukewarm about the Lord. You're hyper-aware of the vicar's house as you pass. You never know when he's peeking through lace curtains, silently ranking parishioners like some moral Olympic judge. By the time you reach the church gate, you've already had more social anxiety than most people experience in a week, and you haven't even sat down yet. You close the door gently behind you, because slamming it would imply chaotic energy, and chaotic energy leads straight to theological questions. Outside, the morning air has that crisp, freshly washed quality that Victorian England is famous for, meaning it smells like coal dust, cabbage, and wet wool. The street is already filling with families who all pretend they just happen to be leaving now, even though everyone knows the exact choreography. Your mother straightens your collar in full view of the neighbours, because nothing says holy, household like aggressive grooming on the doorstep. You try to act natural, which is impossible, because the second you attempt it, your arms forget how to swing normally. Victorian walking becomes performance art, one part dignity, one part restraint, one part praying you don't trip over cobblestones. As you fall into step, you sense eyes on you, not hostile, just observant in that intensely polite Victorian way. Mrs. Carter, 3 houses down gives your family a nod that somehow contains a full TED Talk's worth of judgment and encouragement. She's wearing her best Sunday hat, which is less a fashion accessory and more a public statement of her ongoing righteousness. Your younger siblings walk a little too energetically, and your father clears his throat in that pointed fatherly way that means, walk, but walk like your legs belong to God. The children simmer down immediately, though one of them still hops every 6th step, which will definitely be mentioned at lunch. Speaking of lunch, the butcher stands outside his shop as families pass, smiling broadly as if he isn't cataloguing who bought meat on credit this week. His presence is a reminder that church attendance is not only spiritual, it's also excellent for strengthening community surveillance. The street narrows, funneling everyone toward the church like sheep heading into a theological pen. Boots clack, skirts swish, and muffled greetings float through the air. No one actually stops to chat. That would disrupt the flow and trigger suspicion. Instead, people exchange facial expressions, tiny, efficient greetings that convey, "Yes, I am wholesome. Yes, you are wholesome. Yes, we are both pretending last Thursday's gossip never happened." You pass the vicar's house, which radiates the exact energy of a principal's office combined with a confession booth. Its lace-curtained windows are positioned perfectly for observing the street. You don't see the vicar, but you feel him, the way you feel a teacher in the doorway when you're whispering in class. Part of you imagines him jotting notes, Thompson family, punctual, slightly rushed, youngest child possibly possessed. Halfway to the church, the bells start again, soft, rhythmic, reminding the town that lateness equals moral slippage. A small wave of panic travels through the crowd. The pace quickens, but only tastefully. Running would signal spiritual desperation. Strolling would signal spiritual apathy. You aim for the middle ground, brisk but sanctified. As you near the churchyard, you see the usual suspects. The elderly men who arrive absurdly early to discuss crop prices and salvation. The cluster of teenage girls pretending not to care about the cluster of teenage boys pretending not to care about them. And the one man who always smells faintly of ale but insists he has simply been working near barrels. Everyone is playing their assigned roles. Reaching the church gate feels like finishing the world's least exciting marathon. Your stomach unclenches, your shoulders drop half an inch, and for a brief moment you feel proud of yourself for successfully walking in a straight line without committing a visible sin. But the relief is short-lived, because now you remember, you still have the entire service ahead of you, and the pews are far less forgiving than the street. Inside the church, the spiritual equality of all souls before God runs smack into the practical reality of pew ownership. Seating is not random. It's a carefully curated map of class, income, respectability, and how much your family tithes. The wealthy have pews with cushions and decent sightlines. You have a narrow strip of wood that doubles as a lower back torture device. You slide into your assigned place, acutely aware of everyone around you. The people in front of you sit a little straighter, the people behind you whisper a little more. Shifting seats without permission would be social arson. Even your children learn early that this pew is not just furniture, it's your family's moral coordinates. You can feel the hierarchy radiating down the aisle, like heat from a coal stove. Those who give, those who serve, and those who should probably be grateful for the draft by the door. The moment you step inside, the temperature drops 10 degrees, and the judgment level rises 20. Light streams through the stained glass windows in soft, holy colours that fall in uneven patches, mostly illuminating the richer families, who sit in the warmest centre pews like well-fed cats. Meanwhile, your own pew lies in that special shadowy zone where the drafts live. The wood creaks, and you can see but not necessarily hear the sermon. Your family files in with the precision of a military unit. Everyone knows exactly where they belong because Victorian churches thrive on predictable seating arrangements. Chaos is when someone sits one pew too far forward. That's the sort of thing that could spark an ecclesiastical incident. You take your rightful place, the same patch of splintery wood you've occupied since childhood. The pew feels like an old friend who never liked you. It forces your spine into an unnatural posture that is technically upright but emotionally defeated. As you settle, the wood groans under your weight in a way that instantly draws glances from neighbouring rows. Victorian furniture does not believe in privacy. In front of you sits the Thompson family, prosperous, polished, and aggressively serene. They have matching gloves, matching hats, matching expressions of mild piety. Their pew cushion is handcrafted and suspiciously thick, as if generosity comes with orthopaedic benefits. Every time their youngest child shifts, it's like watching a small angel adjusting its halo. Behind you is the Harris family, known for whispering. They whisper before the service, during the service, after the service, and probably in their sleep. The whispers aren't sinful exactly, but they are distracting, especially when they rise to the level of frantic rustling. You're never sure whether they're gossiping or reciting scripture at extremely high speed. You glance to the left and see the donation box, a wooden gilt machine, and instantly remember why the wealthier pews sit where they sit. Pew rental, tithes, offerings, seasonal fundraisers. The church doesn't explicitly sell salvation, but it definitely sells seating. The nicest pews have the softest cushions, the best view, and superior proximity to the vicar's approving nods. Meanwhile, your pew has a draft so persistent it could qualify as a minor haunting. A child in your row fidgets, and you instinctively reach over to still them. Victorian children aren't allowed to move in church. Movement implies thoughts. Thoughts imply temptation. So children must sit like tiny stone monuments to obedience. A kicked hymnal or a dropped glove can ripple through the congregation like a spiritual earthquake. The organ begins its warm-up groans, the musical equivalent of clearing one's throat after centuries of service. Parishioners straighten their posture all at once, creating a synchronized wave of vertebrae cracking. This is your cue to adopt the proper pew face. Eyes forward, mild expression, hands folded, soul cautiously half awake. As the service begins, you start to feel the invisible currents of status running beneath the stillness. The wealthier families nod with serene confidence, as if the sermon is personally thanking them for their contributions to society. Families like yours nod too, but with the humble eagerness of people hoping God notices they're doing their best with what they've got. If someone new enters the church, a traveller, a cousin, a distant relative from the city, the entire room shifts by one molecule. Heads turn almost imperceptibly. Whispers from the pew behind you gain intensity. Someone quietly updates the mental seating chart. Outsiders, poor souls, always try to sit somewhere open, not realising that open pews are only open in the same way that a wolf's den is open. About halfway through the hymn, you feel the familiar ache settle into your lower back. This is normal. Pain is part of the Victorian religious experience. In fact, it's practically a sacrament. A comfortable churchgoer is a spiritually suspicious one. As the final verse ends, the congregation collectively lowers back into the pews, an echoing thump that vibrates through the wood like a shared confession. For a moment, the hierarchy quiets. Everyone is sitting, everyone is listening, everyone is pretending to understand the vicar's commentary on an obscure Greek verb. But deep down, you know the truth. You're not just sitting in a pew, you're sitting in your place in the universe, or at least your place in the parish ledger. Once the hymns are over, the real endurance test begins, the sermon. The vicar climbs into the pulpit armed with notes, scripture, and a steely determination to make sure you never ever enjoy sin. You shift on the hard pew as he launches into a detailed exploration of some obscure verse from Leviticus, carefully connecting it to your tendency to complain or enjoy sleep. His voice rises and falls in a soothing monotone, the perfect soundtrack for accidental naps. You try to focus, because zoning out feels like spiritual treason. Your mind drifts anyway, to lunch, to the odd crack in the ceiling, to an intrusive thought about how, if sermons were any longer, the second coming might actually happen mid-sentence. When he finally says in conclusion, the entire congregation experiences a small, silent spiritual revival. The vicar's voice is gentle but relentless, a kind of moral white noise machine. Every sentence has the same rhythm: slow build, heavy theological point, mild guilt trip, slow taper. If sermons were a landscape, this would be a long stretch of identical hills with no landmarks except a distant promise of eventual freedom. You sit upright, pretending to understand the significance of goats being inspected for blemishes, while secretly wondering if your shoes are cutting off circulation to 3 toes. The pulpit stands high above the congregation, a wooden lighthouse of disapproval. The vicar peers down occasionally, scanning the rows for signs of spiritual disengagement. You immediately straighten, aware that even blinking too enthusiastically might be interpreted as rebellion. He makes eye contact with you, or at least it feels like he does, and proceeds to discuss the dangers of idleness. You nod with the solemnity of someone hoping to avoid being used as a sermon illustration. Let's talk about the pew itself. The longer you sit, the more it feels like it's actively fighting you. Your lower back sends its first complaint within minutes. Your legs begin the slow descent into numbness. You shift an inch to the left, creak. You shift an inch to the right, another creak. Every sound echoes through the building like a tiny confession. Even clearing your throat risks a side-eyed rebuke from the Harris family behind you, whose whispering continues unabated despite their apparent intolerance for noise. Children, meanwhile, endure the sermon like small prisoners of war. Their eyelids droop, their heads tilt. One of them begins tracing patterns in the air with a finger, until a parent's hand clamps gently onto their wrist, reminding them that the only acceptable gesture right now is stillness. A dropped hymn book could unleash a household crisis that lasts until Wednesday. Halfway through, the vicar adjusts his spectacles with the grave importance of a man about to make a point no one is prepared for. He pivots from goats to gossip, from ancient dietary laws to the spiritual dangers of enjoying yourself too much on a Saturday. The congregation murmurs in agreement. Victorians love a sermon that accuses them of things they haven't done yet. It keeps them on their toes. Your mind drifts again, because humans can only absorb so much Leviticus before the brain begins self-defense maneuvers. You notice the ceiling's wooden beams, massive, dark, slightly warped. Did they look like that last week? Is that a crack or just an aggressive spiderweb? Would the vicar pause mid-sermon if the ceiling collapsed? Probably not. He'd tie it back to Noah somehow. As the sermon hits the 30-minute mark, a strange thing happens. Time slows dramatically. Every sentence stretches like overcooked taffy. The vicar's voice becomes both distant and unavoidable, like the hum of a refrigerator that judges you. You attempt to stay awake by focusing on keywords: salvation, obedience, wickedness, eternal consequences, but your brain keeps slipping into thoughts like, do I have enough potatoes for lunch? Finally, he utters the most anticipated words in Victorian church life. In conclusion. A tiny spark ignites across the congregation like a spiritual brush fire. Heads lift, spines straighten. A child quietly celebrates by breathing in a slightly faster rhythm. Of course, in conclusion does not mean the sermon is ending. It means the vicar is moving into the final 10%, the part where he summarizes everything again in case you forgot your sins, but eventually miraculously it ends. The vicar closes his Bible with a soft thud. The hush falls. You inhale deeply, as if oxygen has finally been returned to the building. And as the congregation prepares to rise for the final hymn, one truth settles over you with the clarity of sunlight through stained glass. You survived. 45 minutes of sanctified jet lag, endured with dignity, discomfort, and only minor spiritual dissociation. If you are a child, church is where fun goes to die. If you're a parent, it's where nerves go to die. Victorian church rules require children to be present but invisible, seen in their best clothes, heard only if singing on cue. You sit wedged between adults, legs going numb, trying not to fidget, sneeze, or accidentally whisper. Drop a hymnal, and your entire future flashes before your eyes. Stern looks, whispered discipline, and a pointed lecture about how Jesus loves children, but also expects them to sit still like small decorative furniture. Parents keep one hand on the Bible and one hand ready to deploy a discreet pinch or whispered threat about what will happen when we get home. Childhood spirituality is less about joy and more about learning that God expects you to be quiet, polite, and slightly terrified at all times. For a Victorian child, church is less a place of worship and more a weekly test of physical endurance. You're dressed in clothes designed by someone who clearly hated children. Stiff fabrics, itchy collars, boots that squeeze your toes into early adulthood. Every inch of your outfit is engineered to produce maximum discomfort with minimum mobility. Sitting still is the goal, and your clothes ensure that sitting still is the only option. Your legs dangle off the pew because they're not quite long enough to reach the floor, leaving them suspended in a perpetual state of pins and needles doom. You swing one foot slightly, just a tiny rebellion, and immediately feel your mother's gloved hand clamp onto your knee like a moral vice. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't have to. The message is clear. Stillness equals salvation. You try to focus on the sermon, which is difficult because you understand approximately 6% of what the vicar is saying. His booming voice echoes through the church like a dramatic reading of a dictionary. Occasionally he says words like obedience, wickedness, or discipline, and you snap to attention, convinced he is talking directly to you. Technically, he kind of is. Victorian sermons treat misbehaving children as a theological category. The hymnals are both your favourite and least favourite part of the service. Favourite because singing allows you to make noise legally. Least favourite because dropping one is the ultimate childhood crime. The sound of a hymnal hitting the floor rings through the sanctuary like a divine alarm bell. If it happens to you, every adult head swivels and your internal monologue collapses into pure panic. This is it. This is how my story ends. Parents, meanwhile, sit in a state of weaponized attentiveness. Victorian parents in church possess two gifts: the ability to follow the sermon and the ability to sense misbehaviour several seconds before it happens. A child so much as thinks about scratching their nose, and an adult hand materialises to redirect the impulse into acceptable piety. Discipline, when needed, is executed with strategic subtlety. A pinch to the arm, a warning whisper so soft it might be the Holy Spirit, a sideways glance that could stun livestock. Occasionally a parent leans down to deliver that chilling phrase every child knows. We will discuss this later. Those words have the same effect as thunder. The children around you engage in their own quiet battles for survival. The boy 2 pews ahead is counting the ceiling beams. The girl beside him is conducting an elaborate mental drama involving angels, horses, and possibly Judgment Day. Babies are bounced softly, their cries silenced with a combination of gentle rocking and maternal telepathy. Even toddlers seem to understand that noise is not an option. They look around in wide-eyed wonder, as if trying to puzzle out why being alive is suddenly a misdemeanor. Your stomach growls, loudly enough to earn a disapproving glance from an elderly parishioner who hasn't eaten since dawn and is therefore morally superior. You press your hands against your abdomen, as though you can manually silence hunger through sheer willpower. Then comes the part of the service known informally as the wiggle crisis. It arrives around the 40-minute mark, when every child in the building simultaneously realises they cannot endure stillness a second longer. Feet shuffle, shoulders twist. One particularly bold child yawns. The entire sanctuary vibrates with unspent energy. Parents tighten their grips. The vicar raises his voice. Heaven watches. And yet, somehow, children make it through. Victorian kids develop a kind of spiritual stamina, an ability to suppress emotions, itchiness, boredom, and existential dread in the name of appearing well-mannered. It is a training ground for adulthood, where they will learn to sit through even longer sermons, even longer meetings, and even longer conversations about morality. As the final hymn begins, you feel the first breath of relief. You survived. You sang on cue. You did not drop anything. You only wiggled slightly, and that will probably not go on your permanent record. When the last amen fades, you rise carefully, legs tingling violently. You shuffle toward the aisle, a freed prisoner blinking in the light. and through the discomfort, you feel a small, strange sense of triumph. You are silent. You are obedient. And if you're lucky, God and your parents were pleased. After church, you finally escape into the blessed world of roast potatoes and questionable gravy. Sunday lunch is the weekly highlight, provided you don't mind it coming with a side of spiritual performance review. As you eat, the morning service is dissected like the meat on your plate. Your father praises the sermon's sound doctrine. Your mother mentions who was missing from church with a tone that suggests illness is not a sufficient excuse, and someone comments on Mrs. So-and-so's new hat with an air of investigative concern. You mostly focus on not dropping gravy on your Sunday best, knowing that stains will be treated like evidence of inner chaos. Between bites, you're asked what you learned, as if salvation is primarily a memorization exercise. By the time the plates are cleared, you're full, slightly drowsy, and more aware than ever that even lunch is part of the weekly moral curriculum. You sit down at the table, the scent of roasted meat drifting up in comforting waves, wrapping around you like an edible hug. Victorian meals may lack seasoning, but they compensate with enthusiasm. A mountain of potatoes glistens on the platter, crisp at the edges, fluffy in the middle, and the gravy boat wobbles ominously, promising flavour or gastrointestinal adventure, depending on how long it simmered and whether anyone remembered to skim it. Your stomach rumbles loudly enough to qualify as a family announcement, but you don't dare reach for anything until your father delivers the obligatory blessing. It is long, thorough, and covers every moral category except perhaps the ethics of overcooked cabbage. When he finally concludes, the table comes alive with movement, forks, serving spoons, passing dishes, and polite negotiations over who gets the crispiest potato. But even in the frenzy, conversation naturally returns to the morning service. It always does. Sunday lunch isn't simply nourishment. It's a continuation of the church, but with better seating and fewer threats of eternal consequences. Your father begins with the sermon review, delivered with the confident tone of a man who believes he would have made an excellent preacher himself, if only someone had asked. He praises the vicar's bold clarity on moral duty as he spoons vegetables onto your plate with the same stern precision. You nod solemnly, despite remembering only fragments of the sermon, mostly involving goats and discipline. Your mother, meanwhile, is working through the attendance ledger in her mind. The Clarksons weren't there, she notes, eyes narrowing in concern that is only 40% charitable. I do hope it wasn't that stomach complaint again. Though they seemed quite well yesterday at the shop, her tone suggests the Clarksons have committed a minor spiritual misdemeanor by failing to show up, and you can almost hear her calculating how many Sundays they've missed this quarter. Then comes the hat commentary. Someone, inevitably, brings up Mrs. So-and-so's newest fashion statement. Very bold, your aunt murmurs, carving her roast with pointed delicacy, almost flamboyant. In Victorian terms, this is the equivalent of alleging the hat has committed tax fraud. The table hums with speculation. Was it appropriate? Was it too bright? Was it expensive? Most importantly, what did it mean? Meanwhile, you're trying to eat without staining your clothing. Sunday best fabrics have a unique magnetic attraction to gravy. One misplaced drip, and suddenly your eternal soul is under review. You cut your meat carefully, shoulders tense, thinking that if God wanted to truly test humanity, he would have invented white tablecloths earlier. Then comes the dreaded question. And what did you learn from the sermon today? This inquiry floats across the table with the faux casual tone of an ambush. You freeze, fork halfway to your mouth and rack your brain for anything that won't sound like you spent the entire sermon contemplating ceiling beams. Obedience, you say, which is always a safe bet. Everyone nods approvingly, because obedience is the Swiss Army knife of Victorian morals. As the meal goes on, plates empty and the warm, heavy sleepiness of Sunday lunch begins to settle over everyone. Even your father relaxes, folding his napkin with the air of a man satisfied that the children have absorbed at least 3 moral lessons before dessert. When the dishes are finally cleared, the room grows quiet, not from peace, but from digestion. You lean back, pleasantly full but subtly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of spiritual analysis you've consumed along with your root vegetables. Sunday lunch could have been a break from church. Instead, it's church with potatoes. And yet, in its own strange way, it's comforting, structured, familiar, predictable as the roast itself. By the time you push back your chair, you're full, drowsy, and spiritually reviewed for the week. The afternoon stretches ahead, and theoretically you should now be free. In reality, you're under the oppressive rule of Sabbath observance. Sunday's a day of rest, but only in the sense that you must rest from anything remotely enjoyable. No playing noisy games, no reading frivolous novels, no unnecessary sewing, and definitely no kicking a ball around in the lane. God apparently keeps close tabs on sports. You're allowed to walk, but only in a way that could be described as meditative rather than having fun. For many families, even laughing too loudly feels risky. You sit with a devotional book open, pretending to be inspired while your brain clawingly misses the concept of hobbies. The day feels oddly longer than the rest of the week combined, proof that time does in fact slow down when you are being spiritually supervised. The Sabbath hours between lunch and evening prayers are a peculiar stretch of time, a sort of moral waiting room where joy must take a number and sit quietly. You open your devotional book, its pages thin and crinkly, smelling faintly of coal dust and the previous owner's piety. The writing is earnest, dense, and determined to prevent even the thought of excitement. You stare at the same paragraph for 10 minutes, absorbing none of it. Your siblings sit nearby, each attempting their own pantomime of spiritual enrichment. One traces patterns on their skirt with a fingertip, another stares at a blank spot on the wall as if hoping it will open into another dimension, preferably one where marbles, hopscotch, and unregulated laughter still exist. Even the family cat senses the mood and moves at half speed, as though aware that too much enthusiasm could compromise everyone's salvation. If you dare to shift in your chair, the wood creaks like a tattletale. Your mother glances up, not displeased exactly, just reminding you that unnecessary movement is dangerously close to activity, which is dangerously close to fun, which is dangerously close to sin. Sabbath logic is a slippery slope. Let's talk about outdoor activity, specifically walking. Walking is allowed, but not joyful walking. There is no skipping, running, or strolling with anything resembling gusto. Victorian Sabbath walks resemble slow pilgrimages, controlled, silent, steeped in reverence, and absolutely devoid of whimsy. You keep your hands folded or behind your back, and your face arranged into the expression of someone contemplating eternity, rather than desperately wishing for a hoop and stick. Sometimes, as you walk, you pass other families doing their own gentle, joyless circuits. Everyone nods politely, acknowledging the shared burden of legally mandated stillness. Children sneak glances at each other, silently mourning the loss of spirited play. A kicked pebble counts as wild rebellion. Back at home, the clock ticks with the smug confidence of an object that knows it cannot be rushed. You swear the second hand moves backwards. Your father sits in his chair reading a theological treatise about avoiding temptations, while your mother pores over Mission Society newsletters that contain both dramatic stories and absolutely no entertainment value. You consider sneaking a novel from the shelf, one with actual plot and characters who have conversations not exclusively about righteousness. But Victorian families store novels like contraband. Some are wrapped in plain covers, others are placed spine in to avoid scandal. Reading one on a Sunday would trigger a full household investigation. The echoes of disapproval could last for weeks. By late afternoon, the air in the sitting room feels thick, as if saturated with unused energy. You shift again, and again the chair creaks. You wish for anything to happen. A knock at the door, a cart rolling by too fast, a stray dog wandering in and causing moderate chaos. But nothing breaks the monotony. The Sabbath is a fortress against excitement. At one point, your father suggests reciting a psalm together, which is the Victorian equivalent of someone in modern times suggesting a team-building exercise during a vacation. You participate, of course, because refusal is not an option. Everyone reads in slow, solemn unison. When the recitation ends, the silence returns, thick, dutiful, lingering like a damp fog. You can feel your energy dissolving into the furniture. You understand now why people fall asleep during sermons. The Sabbath is designed specifically to soften the mind and lull the soul into compliant drowsiness. As the sky begins to dim and the household readies for evening prayers, you glance at the clock again. Shockingly, only 20 minutes have passed since you last checked. Time isn't just slower on Sundays, it's practically horizontal. Still, there's a strange comfort in this enforced quiet. A softness, a rhythm, a sense that nothing is expected of you except peaceful indifference. You close your devotional with a quiet thud, stretch your aching limbs, and prepare for the final round of spiritual duties. And in that moment you realize you have made it through another Sabbath afternoon without smiling too hard. A triumph by Victorian standards. Now let's talk about romance, the Victorian kind, where falling in love feels like trying to negotiate a business merger in a police station. You don't simply date, you are observed. Any interaction with a potential partner takes place in a parlour, within earshot or direct line of sight of an older relative whose idea of fun is ensuring you never sit too close. Every glance is weighted, every word policed. Letters are sometimes read by parents first. Walks are permitted only if there's a chaperone who can outpace you. The church has opinions about suitable matches, same faith, similar status, good reputation, ideally someone who looks like they'd be fine with praying before everything. Passion is fine, as long as it's expressed through polite conversation, shared hymn books, and a general vibe of we are both terribly serious about righteousness. Your love life is less sparks, more committee. Victorian romance operates under a level of surveillance that would put modern CCTV systems to shame. You sit in the parlour, surrounded by an overwhelming quantity of lace, doilies, stiff-backed chairs, and the ever-present scent of lavender polish. The atmosphere is so polite and rigid that even your heartbeat feels like it should ask permission before speeding up. Your potential partner sits across from you, hands folded, posture immaculate, making the entire situation feel like a job interview for the role of your future spouse, pending community approval. Meanwhile, your chaperone, your mother, aunt, or the most nosy elderly neighbour in a 3-mile radius, perches just close enough to hear everything. She pretends to sew, but her needlework hasn't progressed an inch in 20 minutes. She's not here to be productive. She's here to protect your soul from proximity. Conversation becomes a strategic exercise. You cannot flirt directly because flirtation is emotional frivolity, which leads to lapses in righteousness. Instead, you exchange heavily coded comments about weather, sermons, or the price of coal. A slightly longer than usual pause before a reply counts as flirting. Accidentally brushing fingertips while exchanging a teacup is practically elopement. If you're lucky enough to be invited for a supervised walk, an event that requires planning, parental approval, and the alignment of at least 4 social planets, you must walk with the correct emotional geometry. 2 paces apart, hands visible, voices low. The chaperone trails behind, using a pace that somehow keeps her close enough to overhear, but far enough to pretend she isn't. She listens for giggles. Giggles are criminal. Your letters too are not private. Before you send one, your mother inspects it for signs of excessive emotional warmth. Before you receive one, your father holds it to the light, possibly to ensure it contains nothing more scandalous than an inquiry about your health and a reference to yesterday's scripture reading. Behind all of this is the church, quietly steering romance like a solemn air traffic controller. Your match should be doctrinally aligned. No Methodists marrying Baptists without causing a community ripple. The ideal partner is someone with steady employment, a spotless reputation, and a spiritual seriousness that suggests they would never, under any circumstances, dance. And yet, despite the surveillance, romance still finds strange little cracks to bloom through. Maybe your eyes meet for a second longer than necessary during a hymn. Maybe the two of you reach for the same prayer book and pull back at the same moment, sending a shockwave of impropriety through your bloodstream. Maybe you laugh, softly, carefully, but genuinely, and your chaperone glances up, one eyebrow raised like a semaphore flag signalling danger. Expectations weigh heavily. Men are told to be steady, earnest, and spiritually firm, but not so romantic that they seem unserious. Women are coached to be graceful, modest, intelligent in socially acceptable amounts, and ready to manage a household but not ready to express opinions. Both of you are instructed to feel deeply, but show nothing. Courtship becomes a long, drawn-out dance of polite restraint. You learn to treasure small gestures, a shared hymn book, a compliment that borders on daring, your hat is practical today, or the rare thrill of someone remembering your favourite psalm. These tiny moments feel electric precisely because everything else is treated like emotional contraband. And through it all, you sense the unspoken truth. Your romance is never entirely your own. It belongs to the parlour, the parents, the church, the chaperone, the social grapevine, and every laced doily that has ever silently witnessed your attempts at emotional connection. But occasionally, when the chaperone looks away or pretends to count stitches, your eyes meet, and for that fleeting instant you feel like two actual humans instead of two moral resumes. And in Victorian England, that's basically the same thing as passion. Once you've somehow navigated the obstacle course of courtship, getting engaged is not a private romantic moment, it's a community project. The church requires your intention to marry to be announced publicly as the banns, read aloud on 3 consecutive Sundays so that anyone with objections, valid or petty, can speak up. You sit in the pew as your name is proclaimed, feeling like you've just been tagged in front of the entire town. Maybe you're thrilled, maybe you're secretly panicking. Either way, everyone knows. Neighbours whisper, relatives assess, and that one lady who knows everyone's secrets listens very closely. This ritual is sold as protecting the purity of marriage, but it works equally well as an early test of whether you and your partner can survive the combined weight of gossip, scrutiny, and Aunt Margaret's loud stage whispers about your choice. The first Sunday the banns are read feels like stepping onto a tiny stage without warning. You sit stiffly in your pew, hands clasped, trying to look serene but not smug. The vicar clears his throat, opens the parish register, and reads your name aloud with all the pomp of a courtroom verdict. Your future spouse's name follows. There is a small pause, just long enough for the congregation to process the novelty of the pairing, before turning to look at you with the subtlety of a herd of ostriches. A ripple of whispers floats through the sanctuary, not loud enough to be scandalous, but unmistakable. You pretend not to hear anything, although you catch fragments. Oh, well really? With them. I always suspected something. Meanwhile, your younger siblings stare at you with wide, curious eyes, as if you have just been nominated for sainthood. Your father looks proud but restrained, the Victorian version of emotional fireworks. Your mother beams with a glow of triumph, aware that having a child's banns read is essentially a status upgrade. But not everyone is thrilled. Aunt Margaret leans in from 3 pews back, whispering your name in a tone usually reserved for medical emergencies. She mouths something like, "Are you sure?" before being hushed by your uncle, who knows better than to fight her enthusiasm for public commentary. The banns must be read 3 Sundays in a row, which means you get to experience this charming ordeal 2 more times. By week 2, the novelty is worn off for most people, except for those who live for gossip. They sit up straighter, ready to assess whether the vicar will pronounce your name differently, or if your partner's seating location indicates second thoughts. By week 3, you feel oddly numb. The ritual has become part of the liturgy. Hymn, prayer, scripture reading, public exposure of your romantic life, sermon. You barely flinch when your name rings out across the church. But the old lady in the first row still leans forward, cupping her ear, unwilling to miss a single syllable in case there's a surprise twist in your engagement. The whole point of the banns, officially, is to give the community time to raise objections, like the fact that one of you might be secretly married, or related, or morally compromised. In reality, it is the perfect environment for every petty grievance to flourish. Someone might object not because of legal impediments, but because they once saw your fiancé buy the wrong kind of bread. Fortunately, few objections are ever voiced, but the threat hangs in the air like a Victorian plot twist. Outside of church, the bans become the week's hottest topic. Neighbours approach you with congratulatory smiles that feel more investigative than warm. Relatives stop by unannounced to chat, which means performing a forensic analysis of your future spouse's upbringing, habits and haircut. The butcher offers unsolicited advice about maintaining harmony in marriage. The baker hints that he always knew the two of you would end up together, even though he absolutely didn't. Everywhere you go, someone asks how you're feeling, their tone implying they already know you're overwhelmed. Your partner takes it in stride, calm and composed, which only adds pressure. You begin to wonder whether you should be more stoic, or less stoic, or possibly both at once. Yet, beneath the noise and commentary, there is something strangely grounding about it all. For the first time, your relationship is not just your own private knot of emotions. It is woven into the fabric of the community. Everyone witnesses it, acknowledges it, and, for better or worse, becomes part of it. And when the third Sunday passes without objection, you breathe a deep, relieved sigh. The congregation hums with approval. Aunt Margaret finally relaxes her eyebrows. Your engagement has survived the public arena, the whisper networks, and the 3-week audit of your romantic choices. Now comes the easy part, planning a wedding under Victorian moral scrutiny. Your wedding day looks beautiful on the surface. Church bells, white dress, carefully arranged flowers, and a vicar who has definitely performed this exact ceremony 50 times already this year. The vows are solemn and poetic, but woven into the romance are clear expectations. Husbands to lead, wives to obey, both of you to uphold the moral standards approved by the pulpit. You're not just promising to love each other, you're signing up to embody a theological model of marriage where the husband is the spiritual head and the wife is the supportive, silent backbone. The church blesses your union, but also quietly takes notes. Your marriage is now part of the town's moral infrastructure. Your home will be expected to function like a tiny outpost of the church, disciplined, respectable, and definitely not the kind of place where people laugh too loudly on a Sunday. The morning begins with a flurry of lace, whispered instructions, and the faint smell of flowers that were transported far too early and now cling to life out of sheer obligation. You stand in front of the mirror, whether bride or groom, trying to pretend this is all perfectly normal and not a life-altering ceremony conducted in front of dozens of people who have strong opinions about how you should breathe. Victorian weddings are not intimate affairs. They are highly scrutinized community events where everyone from your grandmother to the grocer feels entitled to interpret the symbolism of your floral arrangements. If you're the bride, your dress is a marvel of engineering. Layers of fabric, tucks, and lace conspire to give the impression of graceful purity, while simultaneously restricting your movement to something between gentle glide and half-conscious drifting. Corset laced, veil pinned, bouquet trembling slightly in your hands, you look the part of the Victorian angel. If you're the groom, you've been squeezed into a suit so stiff and upright it's basically a wearable sermon. When you enter the church, the congregation rises, a sea of expectant faces glowing with the thrill of witnessing freshly minted respectability. Everyone leans in with the kind of interest usually reserved for courtroom trials or unexpected firework displays. You walk down the aisle with a sense of being carried along by tradition, spectacle, and the immense gravitational pull of social expectation. The ceremony itself is beautifully rehearsed. The vicar reads the familiar lines with practiced cadence, the biblical references falling around you like petals made of polite obligation. Then the vows arrive, the ones everyone is waiting for. Not the romantic parts about love and honour, but the rules, the expectations, the invisible fine print. Wives, obey your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Everyone nods approvingly, as if you've just recited the user manual for a brand new appliance. You repeat the words, not necessarily because you fully agree with them, but because they are required to unlock the next stage of Victorian adulthood. Inside, you may be thinking, this seems a bit one-sided, but you say nothing because the church aisles amplify doubt into scandal. When the vows are sealed and the rings exchanged, the congregation exhales as one. The kiss, modest, brief, hardly more than a spiritual handshake, elicits a wave of soft smiles. Then the church bells erupt again, announcing your transition from single human to moral role model. You step outside into the cheerful chaos of rice-throwing, shouted blessings, and one overeager relative pushing forward to analyse your emotional state. The reception, if your family can afford one, is a tightly controlled celebration. Light refreshments, polite conversation, and absolutely no dancing unless you want to trigger a theological emergency. People comment on your compatibility, your prospects, your future children, always with the tone of someone filling out a census form. By the time you depart, waved off by a crowd that has thoroughly evaluated your suitability for married life, the truth settles in. You've entered not just a partnership, but an institution, one that comes pre-furnished with expectations, hierarchies, silent judgments, and a lifetime subscription to community oversight. Your new home will be a showcase of order and piety, your marriage, a living example, your behaviour, a sermon in motion, and with that realisation, you step forward into your future, one foot in romance, and one firmly planted in church-approved obedience. Once the rice is swept up and the relatives go home, you finally reach the one part of marriage no one has properly explained. Victorian church culture loves talking about purity before marriage and virtue in general, but provides almost zero practical information about what happens when the bedroom door closes. Many couples arrive at their wedding night with less knowledge than a modern teenager who accidentally click the wrong search result. You might get a cryptic talk from a relative, heavily coded in euphemisms and references to duty. The church's role is mostly to insist that marital intimacy is sacred, private, and absolutely not to be joked about, while also expecting it to produce children frequently and efficiently. If you're confused, anxious, or just incredibly awkward, there is no hotline for that. You figure it out quietly, hoping that whatever you're doing is both technically moral and not going to get you smited. The wedding night begins with an atmosphere so heavy with expectations that you could bottle it and sell it as Victorian anxiety concentrate. The candles flicker. The air smells of lavender sachets and the faint hint of perspiration beneath many, many layers of formal clothing. You stand there in your new marital bedroom, aware that this moment is supposed to mark a profound shift in your life, and equally aware that no one gave you the instruction manual. The room itself looks like something from a moral painting. A large imposing bed, thick curtains that block both light and judgmental stares, a washstand, a Bible on the table, and a silence so dense it could be cut with the cake knife you forgot to return to the kitchen. If you were lucky, an older relative, usually an aunt, pulled you aside earlier and delivered a whispered lecture containing words like tenderness, propriety, and a wife's duty, none of which are actionable instructions. She probably mentioned that nature will guide you, a phrase that provides encouragement only if you have previously met nature and know what she's planning. If you're the bride, your clothing is both symbolic and inconvenient. Removing it requires dexterity and time, and possibly assistance from multiple skilled artisans. Layers of petticoats, stays, hooks, buttons, ribbons, and ties all create a process so elaborate that by the end you feel like you've completed a puzzle designed by someone who hated efficiency. If you're the groom, your attire is slightly simpler but no less stressful. Your hands shake not because of buttons, but because you've never been alone with your wife in this particular way before. Church teaching emphasizes the sanctity of marital intimacy, which is helpful in theory but not in practice. Let your marriage be fruitful, the vicar said earlier that afternoon, a phrase that now lands with the weight of a divine suggestion hovering above your head. You're supposed to know what to do because you are married, and because countless generations before you figured it out without diagrams, explanations, or open conversation. Victorian modesty ensures that no one ever says certain words out loud. Entire concepts are wrapped in layers of implication, delicacy, and metaphor. And you learned more about ancient Hebrew sacrificial practices from sermons than you ever learned about the mechanics of producing the next generation of Victorians. So you and your spouse stand there, two bewildered adults united by holy matrimony, social pressure, and mutual confusion. You exchange awkward smiles. Someone makes a comment about being tired from the day, which is Victorian code for, "Please do not expect me to lead this situation confidently." Eventually, the two of you begin to navigate the moment with the caution of people diffusing an emotional bomb. There is nervous laughter, there is hesitation, there is respect, courtesy, and a sense that you're participating in something important without fully understanding any of the steps. The moment is not glamorous, dramatic, or romantic in the modern cinematic sense. It's tentative, sweet, slightly chaotic, and deeply human. And somehow, despite the lack of guidance, you find your way, not because someone taught you, but because you care, because you're trying, and because marriage is less about flawless performance and more about learning together under historically ridiculous constraints. In the morning, you emerge into the kitchen or sitting room for breakfast, and suddenly every relative behaves differently. Aunt Margaret smiles knowingly. Your mother hovers. Your father clears his throat. Everyone is waiting for you to look embarrassed, triumphant, or mysteriously enlightened. But you simply sit, sip your tea, and hope no one asks questions requiring vocabulary not sanctioned by the church. And with that, you step into married life. Still uninformed, still slightly terrified, but now officially responsible for building a household that will eventually require you to explain this same mystery to your children in even fewer words. In your new household, roles are not negotiated. They're presented as God's eternal blueprint. The church teaches that men should be providers and spiritual leaders, and women should be gentle, selfless, and endlessly available for everyone else's needs. If you're a wife, your job description reads like household manager, emotional support worker, unpaid cook, child-rearing expert, and amateur theologian, with no weekends, no pay, and no HR department. If you're a husband, you're expected to be morally upright, yet it's quietly understood that the bar for male behaviour is mysteriously lower. A man who works, attends church, and doesn't drink too much can be labelled good, whereas a woman is evaluated on every tiny failure. A dusty shelf, a sulky child, a visible opinion. These roles are preached from pulpit and print, so questioning them feels less like social rebellion and more like arguing with God's design team. From the moment you cross the threshold into married life, the expectations settle over you like a heavy embroidered shawl, beautiful in theory, exhausting in practice. Victorian marriage is not merely a personal partnership. It is a public performance of idealized masculinity and femininity. Everyone is watching, from the vicar to the seamstress to the nosy neighbour whose curtains never fully close. Your home is now a microcosm of divine order, or at least a very enthusiastic interpretation of it. If you're the wife, your mornings begin early. Before the sun has fully committed to rising, you're stoking the fire, preparing breakfast, and soothing any children who have already begun generating noise. The house is your sanctuary and your job site. Every task, folding linens, setting the table, darning socks, is imbued with spiritual meaning. A well-run home is proof of virtue. A messy home is proof of moral decay. You must simultaneously maintain perfect calm and perfect efficiency. You're expected to glide from room to room, dispensing wisdom, warmth, and solutions to everyone else's problems, while never appearing overwhelmed. Emotional expression is permitted only if it is serene. Any form of frustration, exhaustion, or commentary on your workload risks being interpreted as a flaw in your character. Meanwhile, your husband returns home from work, removes his hat, and instantly enters a realm where the expectations are somehow both strict and forgiving. He must lead the family in prayer, make the occasional serious decision, and represent the household with dignity. Beyond that, he is largely free to rest, read the paper, and enjoy long philosophical disagreements with the fire. If he has a bad day, he is tired. If you have a bad day, you are slipping spiritually. Victorian gender roles are enforced not only by social custom, but by an extensive library of moral literature. Advice manuals tell wives to remain cheerful, helpful, modest, and endlessly supportive. They tell husbands to be steady, principled, and avoid the pub, though occasional pub visits are tolerated with a wink. After all, men are only human, whereas women are apparently angels with laundry duties. On Sundays, the contrast becomes even sharper. You sit in church listening to sermons about biblical households. Husbands are described as noble protectors, spiritual shepherds of the home. Wives are described as gentle influences, tasked with transforming the house into a moral fortress through good cooking, gentle correction, and the ability to overlook numerous male shortcomings with grace. If you're the wife, your children's behaviour reflects directly on your personal holiness. A tantrum in public might as well be a written confession of poor character. Conversely, if you're the husband, a misbehaving child simply needs firmer guidance, which someone else, usually the wife, will provide. Questioning these roles is not just discouraged, it is almost unthinkable. The church, the magazines, the novels, the neighbours, all reinforce the idea that this is the natural order of things. To suggest otherwise would be like suggesting that gravity needs improvement. And yet, beneath the layers of expectation, real humanity persists. Couples quietly negotiate responsibilities, laugh together behind closed doors, and occasionally break the sacred rules by sitting on the couch at the same time. Husbands sometimes help without announcing it publicly. Wives sometimes express real opinions when no one is listening. Victorian marriage is full of unwritten compromises and whispered rebellions. But publicly the show must go on. The angel in the house floating through chores, the king of the couch consulting his newspaper kingdom. It's a delicate dance of duty, affection, and social performance. One you learn not because it's natural, but because everyone insists it's divine. Alcohol might be legal, but in many church circles it's treated like liquid Satan. Temperance movements are everywhere, and you're strongly encouraged, sometimes pressured, to sign a little pledge promising to avoid drink forever. Meetings feature stirring speeches about ruined families, tragic drunkards, and the moral superiority of tea. If you enjoy a quiet beer, you now do it with the discretion of someone committing minor treason. Respectable households proudly display certificates proving their total abstinence, like spiritual achievement badges. Some churches go further, refusing communion to anyone known to frequent the pub too often. The message is clear. Your relationship with God is being measured in units, and not the fun kind. Even if you personally don't drink, you learn to side-eye anyone who smells faintly of ale, wondering if you've just encountered a walking sermon illustration. The temperance movement isn't just a hobby, it's a cultural phenomenon. The Victorian version of a viral trend, except instead of dancing, everyone is giving up booze. Meetings are held in chilly halls that smell of damp wool and a moral urgency. You sit on a hard bench, listening as earnest speakers detail the horrors of alcohol, poverty, violence, ruined reputations, and the terrible fate of people who admit they enjoy sherry. Their speeches crescendo into applause from the audience, who nod like a choir of upright metronomes keeping time with righteousness. At some point a ledger is brought out, the sacred book of signatures. One by one attendees shuffle forward, gripping pencils as though they are weapons against temptation. Signing the pledge feels both empowering and slightly performative, like joining a very sober secret society. You write your name with care, aware that your handwriting will be judged just as harshly as your commitment to abstinence. Back at home, the certificate of your promise is displayed prominently on the wall, framed with pride. Visitors scan it immediately, because everyone in Victorian England is looking for subtle clues about your moral fortitude. A temperance certificate signals reliability, discipline, and a general promise not to embarrass your family in public. Of course, not everyone is equally enthusiastic. Some sign the pledge repeatedly, breaking it quietly and renewing it loudly. Others avoid signing at all, preferring to keep their options open for the occasional ale after a long week of factory work, farm labour, or simply surviving Victorian life. If you drink, you must now cultivate a high level of secrecy. You become an expert at checking the street before entering the pub, leaving through the side door, and masking the smell with peppermint lozenges. You drink like someone committing espionage. Inside the pub, the atmosphere is a mix of camaraderie and caution. A few men huddle in corners, sipping pints like fugitives. They discuss politics, weather, and how to avoid being spotted by Mrs. Carter, the town's unofficial surveillance department. If she sees you, the information will be in circulation before you finish your drink. Even for non-drinkers, the movement seeps into daily life. Tea becomes a symbol of righteousness, served in quantities large enough to float a small boat. Temperance pamphlets arrive in your post with alarming frequency, filled with illustrations of sad, collapsing husbands and weeping wives. Children memorize little rhyming oaths about sobriety, performing them like moral party tricks. The church's involvement intensifies the whole situation. Sermons reference alcohol so often that you begin to suspect the vicar has a personal vendetta against barrels. Communion wine in some places is swapped for grape juice or weak, depressing substitutes that taste like regret. The message is unmistakable. Moral purity and physical purity are intertwined, and both can be ruined by a single sip. If you smell ale on someone in church, your mind leaps to conclusions. Are they struggling, falling, becoming the sermon's next protagonist? Even innocent explanations, like standing near a brewery, don't stand a chance against Victorian imagination. Temperance clubs host events too, lectures, musical evenings, sewing circles, all carefully structured to fill your time with moral activities so you don't accidentally wander into temptation. These events are well attended, if not always enthusiastically. You sit sipping lukewarm tea while someone sings a ballad about the evils of gin. But beneath all the drama, the movement is driven by something surprisingly understandable. Fear of chaos in a world held together by fragile order. Alcohol represents disorder, unpredictability, human weakness, the very things Victorians work tirelessly to suppress. Temperance becomes not just a lifestyle but a coping mechanism for an era that fears losing control, and so, whether you're a true believer or a reluctant signer, you learn to navigate the era of teetotaling with grace, subtlety, and far too much tea. Because in Victorian England, nothing says I love God quite like proudly refusing a perfectly good drink. In a Victorian Christian household, children are not just kids, they're spiritual projects. Your parents are constantly reminded that they are responsible for your soul, which does nothing good for your chances of having a carefree childhood. Bible stories double as moral warnings, and disobedience is treated like a small rehearsal for eternal consequences. Discipline is physical, frequent, and almost always framed as for your own good. You memorize verses, attend Sunday school, and answer questions about sin with the seriousness of a tiny lawyer. Even your playtime gets regulated. Certain games are worldly, certain songs too frivolous. You grow up understanding God less as a source of comfort and more as an invisible quality control inspector, peering over your shoulder while you attempt not to track mud into the house. Love is there, absolutely, but it's tightly bundled together with anxiety, rules, and a constant pressure to turn out right. Childhood in this world begins early and earnestly. Before you even know how to tie your shoes, you already know the difference between righteousness and wickedness, because someone has explained it to you using a flannel graph, a parable, and a wooden spoon. Each new day starts with prayer, scripture reading, and a gentle reminder that your eternal destiny hinges on your ability to sit still and obey quickly. Even story time has an edge to it. While modern children get whimsical tales about bears who eat porridge, or trains learning life lessons, your library consists of morally instructive biographies and Bible tales where people are swallowed by whales or turned into salt. Your parents read them in a calm, soothing tone, as if these are perfectly reasonable bedtime stories. You fall asleep thinking about Nineveh, judgment, and whether an angel is currently grading your behaviour on a celestial clipboard. Discipline, of course, is an art form. Victorian parents believe deeply in the doctrine of spare the rod, spoil the child, a concept that translates into brisk, decisive correction delivered with spiritual commentary. When you misbehave, your parents sigh heavily, quoting Proverbs as though the Bible itself is disappointed in you. Punishment is never framed as anger. It is love. It is duty. It is soul maintenance. And yet, for all the strictness, there is tenderness. Your parents genuinely think they're protecting you from sin, from moral decay, from the terrifying prospect of becoming the kind of adult who whistles on Sundays. They hug you after disciplining you. They pray for you nightly. They worry constantly about your future, spiritual or otherwise. But their anxiety is contagious. You learn to look inward, constantly monitoring yourself for signs of rebellion, selfishness, or excessive giggling. Sundays bring another layer of structure. You march to Sunday school in your best outfit, stiff, slightly itchy, and designed to prevent slouching. The room is filled with earnest teachers, chalkboards covered in scripture verses, and other children who stare at you with the same wide-eyed solemnity you feel. You recite your memory verses carefully, terrified that forgetting a word will reveal a fatal flaw in your moral fibre. At home, the expectations continue. Playtime is permitted, but only if your games reinforce discipline, creativity, or virtue. Anything loud, competitive, or remotely fun is labelled worldly. Singing is allowed, but your songs must be uplifting. Humming a jaunty tune from the street is dangerous territory. Even toys come with moral undertones, blocks to build discipline, dolls to practice nurturing, and definitely no toy soldiers unless they are fighting metaphorical battles against sin. You learn early that emotions are suspicious. Anger is sinful. Loud joy is chaotic. Even enthusiasm must be carefully calibrated. Too much expresses vanity. Too little suggests ingratitude. So you cultivate a polite, moderate, emotional palate, like a small diplomat negotiating with your own heart. But amid all this structure, love persists. Real, complicated, earnest love. Your parents tuck you in at night with the same hands that corrected you earlier. They kiss your forehead and whisper prayers over you. They want you to thrive, and in their world, thriving means being righteous, composed, diligent, polite, and deeply aware of hell's marketing strategies. And so, you grow up walking a tightrope between affection and expectation, childhood and holiness, curiosity and caution. You are loved. You are guided. You're supervised by God, parents, neighbours, and the occasional illustrated tract. Victorian childhood is not carefree, but it forges souls with the determination of a blacksmith and the anxiety level of a modern student preparing for finals. When you finally reach for something fun, say a romantic novel or an invitation to a dance, the church rules are right there too, gently suggesting that joy is a slippery slope. Fiction is treated with suspicion, especially if it involves romance, adventure, or characters who enjoy themselves too much without being punished. You may be warned that novels give you ideas and distract you from more worthy reading, like sermons or improving biographies. Dancing is even more hazardous. Bodies, music, proximity, all the stuff sermons subtly panic about. Some congregations ban dances outright. Others permit very stiff, supervised versions that feel more like synchronized walking. The assumption is simple. If you start enjoying yourself unsupervised, moral decay cannot be far behind. You learn to negotiate your pleasures like contraband, borrowed books, secret humming, a half-remembered dance step practiced in the privacy of your room. Victorian entertainment, as it turns out, is a spiritual minefield. The moment your eyes land on a novel with a heroine who has opinions, or a hero who smiles too easily, alarm bells begin ringing, not in your mind, but in the minds of your parents, your pastor, and possibly an entire women's improvement society somewhere across town. Fiction, according to many, is the gateway drug to imagination, and imagination is the gateway drug to sin. You hold the book anyway, marvelling at its forbidden promise. The pages smell faintly of dust and excitement. The heroine is described as spirited, already a red flag. The hero has a mysterious past, another red flag. You sneak the book into your room, tuck it under your pillow, and read it in tiny increments as though absorbing too much plot at once might summon a concerned deacon to your bedside. Your mother, meanwhile, is constantly on the lookout for inappropriate literature, a category that includes almost everything except sermons, botanical manuals, and biographies of missionaries who died tragically young. If she catches you reading a novel, she gently takes it from your hands and replaces it with something more virtuous, like the life and teachings of Reverend Darnley who never smiled. And then there is dancing. Dancing in the Victorian religious imagination occupies the same conceptual space as juggling knives while blindfolded, unnecessary, dangerous, and likely to lead to spiritual injury. You may receive an invitation to a local social gathering, a dance, though this word is whispered only in trusted company. The card is rigid, elegant, and lightly perfumed with danger. You're thrilled. You're terrified. You're already rehearsing excuses in case God asks where you were. Attending such an event requires diplomacy. You float the idea to your parents, who respond with a silence so tense you can hear the wallpaper listening. Your father clears his throat. Your mother blinks twice. Someone mentions the fall of Babylon. But let's imagine for a moment that permission is granted. You arrive at the hall dressed in your best, feeling like a criminal in silk. The room buzzes with cautious excitement. The music begins slowly, carefully, with the emotional depth of a funeral procession. Partners stand at a polite distance, hands hovering near shoulders but never quite connecting. The dance itself resembles two people trying to avoid each other while maintaining synchronization. Still, even this controlled version of joy is intoxicating. A glance lingers too long. A footstep feels bold. The music swells, and suddenly you remember that your body contains bones, joints, and the potential for rhythm. It is exhilarating. It is forbidden. It is basically cardio with consequences. Of course, there are always chaperones. They line the walls, eyes sharp, hands folded, energy focused like moral surveillance drones. If you laugh too loudly, one materializes beside you to ask if you're feeling well. If you step too close to your partner, you're gently but firmly repositioned. Dancing is allowed, but only in the sense that a bird is allowed to fly in a cage. In the aftermath, you carry the memory of that exhilaration with you, stored deep in your chest like contraband joy. You might hum one of the melodies under your breath days later, stopping abruptly if your father enters the room. At home, your pleasures are small, careful things. You read your novel in 5-minute bursts behind closed doors, one ear always tuned for footsteps. You practice a dance step while brushing your hair, pretending you're merely adjusting your footwork for balance. Victorian fun is not spontaneous. It is negotiated, concealed, rationed out like sugar in wartime. You learn to savour it precisely because it is forbidden. And in quiet moments, when the house is still and the moral surveillance system is powered down for the night, you let yourself imagine a world where dancing is just dancing, novels are simply stories, and joy doesn't require strategic planning. But for now, pleasure is a private rebellion, and you are becoming an expert. Charity is not optional. It's a crucial part of your family's religious image. The church expects you to give to the poor, support missions, and contribute to relief funds, all while making sure your own behaviour doesn't accidentally qualify you as a charity case. Collections are taken at services, and who gives what becomes unofficial public knowledge? You might help pack baskets of food for struggling families, practicing compassion while also subconsciously learning which households are falling behind. Church magazines arrive full of stories about heroic giving, lists of donors, and inspirational tales of sacrificial generosity. It's a genuine attempt to relieve suffering, but it's also a subtle competition in virtue. You grow up knowing that righteousness looks like open wallets, stiff upper lips, and a firm conviction that needing help is a regrettable but morally instructive experience for other people, ideally. In your home, charity begins not with emotion but with organisation. There is a drawer, usually in the sideboard, filled with pamphlets from 6 missionary societies, each urging your family to support distant strangers with compelling names and alarming levels of need. The pamphlets feature engraved illustrations of solemn missionaries standing beneath palm trees or braving snowstorms, depending on geography, looking heroic, thin, and extremely Protestant. Your mother reads every pamphlet carefully, making little humming noises of concern as she decides how much your family can spare this month without sacrificing the roast beef budget. Your father contributes as well, but mostly in the form of nodding gravely and saying things like, "We must do our part, which means your mother will adjust something in the household accounts." At church, charity becomes a spectator sport. The collection plate moves slowly down each pew, passing hands like a ceremonial object. You drop your coins in with as much flourish as you can muster, hoping nobody notices the smallness of the amount. The wealthy parishioners, meanwhile, slide envelopes onto the plate with an elegant nonchalance that suggests both humility and a confident awareness of their own generosity. No one says they're watching, but everyone is. The church bulletin frequently lists top donors for special causes, a tradition that blends inspiration with light intimidation. When you spot your family name, you feel a warm glow of civic righteousness. When you don't, your mother develops the tight-lipped expression of someone planning to give more next time, even if it means fewer candles for the dining table. Beyond money, charity also requires labour. Your family often participates in preparing baskets of food and clothing for poorer households. You stand in the kitchen, wrapping bread in paper, stacking turnips, or folding serviceable but deeply unfashionable garments. It feels good, noble even, until you notice the subtle commentary that accompanies each basket. Poor Mrs. Bennet. She's simply not managing her home. Such a shame about Mr. Gray. If only he avoided the alehouse. One hopes the children will learn better habits. Charity in this context is empathy laced with sociology. You learn early that helping the poor is righteous, but becoming poor signals a lapse in personal discipline, moral fortitude, or maybe just housekeeping. In short, charity is uplifting when you're giving, unsettling when you're receiving. Church magazines reinforce the point. Every issue includes heroic tales of people giving away their last coins to save a stranger, or missionaries sacrificing comfort for the gospel, or widows donating small amounts with enormous faith. After reading enough of these stories, you start to feel guilty for owning a comfortable chair. And then there are the bazaars and charity teas, grand events designed to raise money through the combined power of baked goods, knitted doilies, and mild social pressure. Women circulate among tables, selling jams and embroidered bookmarks with the zeal of professional fundraisers. Men donate items for raffles, pretending not to care whether their contribution is deemed impressive. Even children contribute handmade crafts, which are praised for their sweet sincerity regardless of aesthetic quality. The gatherings are lively, full of polite laughter and delicate refreshments. But beneath the cheerful exterior lies the subtle tension of one-upmanship. Whose jam sold fastest? Whose donation was most admired? Whose generosity was whispered about approvingly near the cucumber sandwiches? And yet, despite the competition, the optics, the occasional whiff of sanctified pride, charity also creates a sense of purpose. It draws people together, offers hope to struggling families, and allows you to feel part of something larger than your household. You ladle soup at fundraisers, you help box clothing, you smile at grateful recipients, and inside, part of you feels genuinely moved, because at its heart, Victorian charity is a strange blend of compassion, duty, social theatre, and genuine desire to make life a little less miserable for someone else. Good works, good optics, good intentions, all neatly packed together, like those baskets you assemble in your kitchen, each item wrapped in love, expectation, and just a little bit of judgment. In a tightly controlled moral universe, information is power, and that's where church-sanctioned gossip comes in. Officially, people are just concerned about one another. Unofficially, everyone knows who's falling behind on attendance, whose son was seen near the pub, whose daughter is spending too much time with someone from the wrong denomination. Prayer meetings can turn into highly coded update sessions. We must pray, especially for the Jones family as your cue, that something interesting has happened. The church also reserves the right to step in more formally. In some communities, overt scandal, pregnancy out of wedlock, blatant drunkenness, marital separation can lead to public rebukes or quiet exclusion from communion. The line between pastoral care and social control is very thin. You learn early that the safest way to live is to sin discreetly, repent privately, and never ever give anyone a good story. Gossip in Victorian church culture isn't loud or chaotic. It's refined, structured, almost liturgical. You never hear someone shout, "Did you hear about Mr. Thompson?" Instead, it comes wrapped in soft tones and spiritual vocabulary. Someone leans closer, lowers their voice, and sighs deeply before saying, "We must keep the Thompsons in our prayers." Translation: prepare for a morally instructive plot twist. Even children catch on quickly. A name mentioned in the special petitions part of prayer night sparks immediate interest. You learn to decipher the codes. They're going through trials equals someone did something. They need guidance equals someone did something public. They require discernment equals someone did something juicy. Adults pretend the updates are purely for intercession, but everyone leans in, heads tilt, eyebrows lift, hands clasp a little tighter, as if preparing to receive divine illumination in the form of community news. The grapevine works at supernatural speeds. A rumour whispered at the bakery in the morning somehow appears at choir practice by evening, fully developed and carrying sources who may or may not exist. If Mrs. Carter saw the shadow of your cousin walking near the tavern, the entire congregation will know before the week ends. By Sunday, the vicar may even drop a subtle hint in the sermon about those who wander from the straight path. Discretion does exist, but mostly in the sense that gossip arrives gently, wrapped in a quilt of piety. Someone might deliver shocking news while pouring tea with perfect elegance. It grieves me to say this, but Mr. Clark's horse was found unattended at the edge of town last night. A pause, a raised eyebrow. One wonders what kept him. If the scandal is large enough, a runaway marriage, a child born suspiciously early, a man seen staggering home on a weekday, you might receive a formal church response. Sometimes it's a stern pastoral visit, sometimes it's private counselling, and sometimes, for especially dramatic situations, there's a public rebuke during service, delivered in solemn tones that make you grateful the spotlight is not currently on you. Quiet exclusion from communion is another tactic. One Sunday, someone simply doesn't walk up. No explanation, but everyone knows. Communion absence is Victorian for "please speculate about my moral failure." And because everyone is painfully aware of this system, life becomes a delicate exercise in avoiding misinterpretation. You don't walk too quickly past the pub. You don't linger too long talking to someone of the opposite sex. You definitely don't argue with your spouse in public unless you want your marital tension added to the communal prayer list. You learn the rules early. Sin discreetly. Repent privately. Smile publicly. And above all, give no one a story good enough to survive church lunch. Yet despite all the scrutiny, gossip also knits the community together in a strange, contradictory way. People check on each other, support each other, rally around those who stumble. Yes, it's invasive. Yes, it's exhausting. But beneath the layers of whispered judgment lies genuine concern, admittedly expressed through a communication method that resembles spiritual espionage. Because in the Victorian church, minding your own business is not a virtue. Minding everyone else's business, however, now that's ministry. As the century rolls on, new ideas start knocking at the stained glass windows. Books about geology, evolution and deep time appear, and suddenly the age of the earth is up for debate in households that previously argued only about wallpaper. Some churches react by doubling down, insisting that every word of Genesis must be read literally. Others cautiously attempt to make peace between fossils and faith. If you're an inquisitive type, this is both thrilling and terrifying. You might sneak a look at controversial books, then feel your stomach twist when you hear them denounced from the pulpit. Dinner conversations become mental obstacle courses as you try to reconcile the vicar's certainty with the professor's lectures or what you read in the newspaper. Doubt itself is treated like a moral hazard, so you learn to keep your questions folded up and hidden, like contraband under your mattress. The whole situation begins innocently enough. Someone in town buys a book on geology, a thick one, full of diagrams and layers of rock that suggest the Earth is older than 6,000 years. You overhear whispers about it at the market. Dangerous ideas, one woman murmurs, clutching her basket of turnips like a religious artifact. Another calls geology unsettling, which is Victorian for burn it immediately. But curiosity is contagious. Soon your father is reading a newspaper article about Darwin's theory, eyebrows raised, lips pursed. He doesn't say anything at first. He's mentally preparing his Sunday opinion. Your mother, meanwhile, mutters that monkeys are disrespectful creatures, implying that any theory involving them must naturally be suspect. Then comes Sunday, and the pulpit erupts. The vicar delivers a sermon on the dangers of prideful science, men digging up bones they shouldn't touch, questioning mysteries that belong to God alone, and reading books that cloud the mind with unproductive speculation. You sit there sweating because last night you stayed up reading a paragraph from On the Origin of Species and thought, well, that makes sense. Now you feel like Charles Darwin himself is hiding under your pew, ready to drag you into an abyss of moral ambiguity. At home, the dinner table becomes a theological battlefield disguised as a meal. Someone brings up fossils, someone else brings up Adam and Eve, someone quotes the Bible, someone quotes a professor, and someone very determined quotes both while carving the roast. It's chaotic. You try to eat quietly, avoiding eye contact in case anyone suspects you're harbouring questions. Questions are dangerous. Questions are slippery. You learn to tuck them behind your ribs like illicit cargo. If you're bold enough to ask your parents something mild, but what if the Earth is older? Your father freezes mid-bite, fork suspended. Your mother's eyes widen. A chill sweeps through the room. It's like you've asked whether the Queen juggles in her spare time. They remind you gently, firmly, that faith is simple and science should not complicate it. You nod, swallowing both your disagreement and a mouthful of potatoes. Still, the world keeps expanding. Railways spread, newspapers circulate, lectures tour the country. Every now and then someone smuggles a scientific pamphlet into the house, the way others smuggle romance novels. You flip through it cautiously, scanning diagrams of skulls and timelines of ancient life. The ideas feel enormous, horizon-stretching. But then you remember the pulpit's warnings, the certainty, the solemnity, the vicar's insistence that questioning Genesis is like questioning your mother's cooking. Technically possible, but socially suicidal. So you keep the pamphlet hidden. You ask fewer questions aloud. You develop a quiet double life, outwardly devout, inwardly curious. Many Victorians do the same. The pews are filled with people pretending their brains haven't expanded beyond their hymn books. As time goes on, you become quite skilled at compartmentalizing. You can discuss the flood with conviction, while privately wondering why so many fossils exist. You can nod along to sermons while remembering diagrams of ancient fish with unsettlingly human expressions. The tension is uncomfortable, but also oddly invigorating. Your world is bigger than your church wants it to be, and yet you cannot say that. Not here. Not now. So you fold your doubts into the quiet corners of your mind, neat and hidden, like a pressed flower in a book you never show anyone. In Victorian life, faith and science coexist, but only if they don't bump into each other at dinner. Not every Victorian family fits neatly into one religious box. Maybe your mother was raised Anglican, your father likes the Methodists, your uncle is suspiciously fond of the Baptists, and your sister is flirting with something called Salvationism with brass bands. The result? Sunday is a logistical and emotional circus. Where you attend church becomes a weekly negotiation, sometimes a quiet battle. The church you choose signals your theology, your social aspirations, even your politics. Some relatives consider chapel people a bit too emotional. Others think traditional parish worship is spiritually dead. Mealtimes can turn icy if someone suggests the wrong preacher is worldly or legalistic. The rules don't stop at your front door. They follow you in, multiplied by every denominational loyalty. You learn to navigate not only God's expectations, but also competing human interpretations of what exactly God wants from your family this week. From the outside, your household looks harmonious. Lace curtains, tidy flower beds, a Bible placed tastefully on a side table. But inside, Sunday morning, is a game of theological tug-of-war. Your mother insists the Anglican service is the proper one, structured, dignified, blessed by centuries of tradition. Your father, meanwhile, prefers the energy and simplicity of the Methodist chapel, where the hymns are livelier and the sermons shorter. Uncle George shows up unpredictably, advocating for the Baptist with the enthusiasm of a man who has recently read a very persuasive pamphlet. Your sister complicates matters further. She returns from town one day humming a marching tune, announcing that she has been moved by the Salvation Army. She speaks dreamily about open-air meetings and tambourines. Your parents exchange looks that convey a mutual fear of emotional expression in public. Choosing where to worship becomes an elaborate ritual. Someone brings up the vicar's recent sermon, too stern, too soft, too intellectual, too simple. Someone else counters with the Methodist preacher's fine message on charity. Uncle George throws in a comment about the importance of adult baptism. Then your sister declares that spiritual awakening is impossible inside a building at all. You stare at your plate of porridge, hoping no one asks for your opinion. Theological differences seep into every corner of family life. During dinner, the conversation begins harmlessly enough. Weather, crops, the cost of coal, until someone casually references church. Suddenly the atmosphere thickens. Your mother's spoon pauses mid-air as your father remarks that the Methodist chapel plans to install a new harmonium. Harmoniums are terribly showy, she says, in the same tone someone else might use to accuse someone of arson. Your father bristles. Music uplifts the soul. Discipline uplifts the soul, she counters. Uncle George chuckles, sipping his tea. At least neither of you attends the Congregationalists. They clap. Clapping to your mother is the liturgical equivalent of public disorder. Meanwhile, your sister rolls her eyes and declares that all this argument proves organised religion is missing the point. Real faith, she says dramatically, belongs in the streets. She pounds the table for emphasis, accidentally knocking over the salt cellar. Everyone stares at the spilled salt like it's a theological omen. The next morning the argument resumes in quieter tones. Your mother hands out church hats with the determination of someone preparing soldiers for battle. Your father debates aloud whether the Methodist service might have better hymns this week. You wait, clutching your coat, as though someone might appoint you ambassador to whichever side wins. Eventually a decision is made, not through agreement but through exhaustion. This week, you will attend the Anglican parish. Next week, perhaps the chapel. After that, your father insists on visiting the Baptist just to compare teachings. In 3 weeks, your sister will drag at least one unwilling family member to an outdoor Salvation Army meeting, where you will try not to make eye contact with anyone playing a trombone. Back home, the theological Cold War continues in subtle jabs. Your father compliments the Reverend's sermon. Your mother reminds him that liturgy prevents doctrinal drift. Uncle George praises the Baptist emphasis on personal conviction. Your sister talks about spiritual fire with a gleam in her eye that makes everyone nervous. You learn to keep your head down, your Bible open, and your opinions flexible. After all, you're navigating not just scripture, but an entire ecosystem of belief systems, each convinced it is the correct flavour of righteousness. And beneath it all, one quiet truth becomes clear. If God intended Victorian families to agree on everything, he would not have invented denominations. But since he did, your household must operate like a diplomatic embassy, polite, tense, and forever negotiating the terms of its own spiritual peace treaty. The world is getting bigger, and the church wants your family to care deeply about places you'll never visit. Missionary societies send magazines full of dramatic stories about faraway lands, often written with more enthusiasm than sensitivity. Evenings are spent reading aloud about heroic missionaries and heathen peoples in need of the gospel. Collections are taken, boxes placed in parlours, children encouraged to donate pennies to adopt converts in spirit. It's a strange mix of genuine compassion, imperial confidence, and a firm belief that your little Victorian household has a role in reshaping the entire planet. You might be fascinated by the exotic details and uncomfortable with the tone without having the language to say why. Still, the expectation is clear. A truly Christian family supports the spread of its rules elsewhere, exporting its anxieties and certainties across oceans, one prayer meeting at a time. Missionary fervour begins at home, specifically in the parlour, where missionary magazines pile up like spiritual homework. Their covers feature woodcut illustrations of distant landscapes, jungles, deserts, snow-covered plains, all populated by stoic missionary couples standing with Bibles in hand and expressions of earnest endurance. You flip through the pages and discover dramatic accounts of storms survived, illnesses defeated, and conversions achieved through equal parts prayer and stubbornness. Your parents treat these magazines like sacred texts. They read each issue aloud with solemn voices, pausing to murmur comments like, "Such bravery," or "Imagine the suffering they endure for the Lord." You nod politely. The stories are compelling, frightening, and occasionally confusing. You've never seen a palm tree, but now you know that beneath its leaves lurk countless souls waiting for Victorian intervention. Money boxes labelled "For the Mission." Fields sit in prominent places around the house. They rattle ominously, reminding you that your spare pennies deserve a higher purpose than candy or marbles. Every time you drop a coin into one, it feels like you are funding the salvation of someone you will never meet. Your parents insist that your contribution matters, and perhaps it does, if not practically, then at least in building a sense of moral responsibility that will follow you into adulthood, like a well-trained shadow. Missionary societies also organise events, lectures, teas, fundraising bazaars. At these gatherings, you listen to returned missionaries speak with breathless conviction about their work abroad. Some describe their adventures like epic tales. Others recount hardships with stoic calm. You struggle to reconcile their narratives, both inspiring and unsettling, with the smallness of your own life. The global map becomes a moral scoreboard. Certain continents are frequently mentioned as needing extra prayer. Certain countries become known to you only through missionary anecdotes, which describe local customs with the combination of fascination and cultural superiority that Victorians specialise in. You repeat these details at school, unaware that your understanding of the wider world is being shaped by people who travelled with strong opinions and limited anthropology training. Yet beneath the imperial confidence lies genuine compassion. Your mother prays fervently for missionaries by name. Your father donates part of his wages each month. Families gather in parlours to knit scarves, pack medical supplies, and write comforting letters to missionaries serving in climates that would terrify most Englishmen. Somewhere between the moralising and the misunderstanding, real concern exists. You, meanwhile, develop a complicated fascination. The stories of faraway places are the closest thing to adventure you'll ever encounter. They spark your imagination. Oceans crossed, mountains climbed, languages learned. But you sense something else too, a tension, a discomfort, a question you don't know how to ask. Why does the world have to look like us to be considered good? You may not articulate it, but the question remains, lodged in your chest like a small persistent pebble. Still, every Sunday the missionary collection plate comes around, and you place your coin inside. Every prayer meeting includes petitions for the brave couples labouring abroad, and every issue of the missionary magazine is dutifully read aloud, accompanied by tea and quiet nods. Your world is small, but your obligations stretch continent to continent, because in Victorian life, God is everywhere, and your family's job apparently is to send him postage. For all the outward certainty, doubt lives quietly in Victorian households like a very polite ghost. Maybe you lie awake at night wondering if God is as strict as the sermons suggest, or if the rules are more cultural than divine. Maybe your prayers feel like they bounce off the ceiling, or you secretly enjoy books and music everyone calls worldly. You might find yourself going through the motions, church, hymns, family prayers, while your inner life drifts elsewhere. Admitting this would feel catastrophic. To question the church's rules isn't just to risk being wrong, it's to risk losing your place in the family, the community, the entire structure that tells you who you are. So you develop a double life, obedient outwardly, experimental inwardly. Your true thoughts live in journals, whispers, or silent eye rolls no one sees. It's lonely, but it's safer than saying, "I'm not sure" out loud. Doubt in Victorian life isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't kick down the door and announce itself with a flourish. Instead, it tiptoes in late at night when the house is quiet and everyone else is confidently asleep. It arrives while you stare at the ceiling, your mind wandering into forbidden territory. What if the rules aren't the whole story? What if faith is bigger than the vicar's list of weekly warnings? What if God actually likes laughter? These thoughts feel dangerous not because they're inherently scandalous, but because you have never once seen them spoken aloud. In your world, certainty is a virtue, questions are a risk, and curiosity is something best exercised on safe topics, like geography, or the tensile strength of different kinds of twine. But doubt, once it appears, becomes a quiet companion. It sits beside your bed while you listen to the wind rattling the window panes. It hovers at the edge of your mind during long sermons, gently questioning the logic behind every warning about temptation. It lingers in your heart whenever someone tells you that God has firm opinions about your reading choices or posture. You learn to hide it. Victorian secrecy is an art. You keep journals written in careful coded language, entries that look like reflections on scripture, but occasionally contain a rebellious line like, "Is this really necessary?" You tear out pages if they seem too bold. You hide the journal behind a stack of improving books no one voluntarily opens. When you're with friends, your inner rebellion shrinks to microscopic gestures, an eye roll so subtle it registers only at the atomic level, a whispered joke that dissolves into polite laughter before anyone can label it irreverent. You might hum a tune you heard at the theatre, stopping abruptly when footsteps approach. Your outward self remains impeccable. You sit straight in the pew. You recite every memory verse. You fold your hands during prayer, smooth your expression, and appear as composed as a moral statue carved from Victorian self-control. No one suspects that your mind is busy asking questions you cannot afford to say out loud. Sometimes the doubt feels thrilling, a spark of independence in a life full of instructions. Other times it feels like a weight, a secret you carry alone. You watch others living with similar strain. Your cousin who devours adventure novels in the barn, your friend who slips out during revival meetings to breathe fresh air, your uncle whose long walks grow longer every Sunday afternoon. Everyone pretends to be certain, but everyone is pretending. Only occasionally do you meet someone who hints, very gently, that they understand. A teacher who encourages questions within reason. A friend who confesses they also struggle to pray some nights. A sibling who whispers, "Do you ever wonder?" before trailing off in fear. These small moments of shared humanity feel like flickers of candlelight in a dark corridor. Brief, warm, and too delicate to expose. You wish sometimes that doubt were allowed, that questions could be asked without risk, that people could say, "I don't know," and the sky wouldn't fall. But Victorian life is built on structure, thick, intricate, interlocking. Questions loosen the beams, doubt shakes the foundation. So you hold your uncertainty in silence. You wrap it in prayer, curiosity, guilt, and possibility. Some days it feels like rebellion. Other days it feels like breathing. And in the quiet corners of your life, behind closed doors, beneath lamplight, inside your own mind, you begin to build something tentative and fragile. A faith that's still yours, still seeking, still whispering its way toward truth, even when your lips cannot. When someone in the family dies, the church steps in immediately, cloak and ritual at the ready. Funerals are solemn, structured, and full of reminders about eternity. Mourning itself has rules: what you wear, how long you wear it, what you say, where you sit in church afterward. Black clothes signal grief, but they also signal your compliance with expectations. Your sorrow is real, but it has to move along designated channels, approved hymns, approved phrases, approved tears. The churchyard becomes both a comfort and a threat. Loved ones laid to rest, but also an ongoing reminder that failure in this life might echo forever. At the same time, the shared rituals can hold you up when nothing else makes sense. For all its strictness, the church gives structure to chaos, a script to follow when your own words fail. Grief is both controlled and contained, never entirely private. Victorian mourning begins the moment the news spreads, long before the coffin is ordered or the minister notified. Word travels quickly, carried by neighbours with sympathetic expressions and an unspoken eagerness to report correctly. People arrive at your door, offering condolences wrapped in etiquette, soft voices, clasped hands, and the careful avoidance of any phrase not officially sanctioned for grief. You barely have time to process your own emotions before being ushered into mourning as a full-time occupation. Your wardrobe shifts overnight. If you're a close relative, you are now sentenced to months or years of black fabric. Mourning attire is not simply dark clothing. It is a strict uniform that broadcasts your loss to the community. Heavy crepe dresses, dull buttons, thick veils. Your appearance becomes a public announcement of sorrow and duty. You wear grief not only in your heart, but on your sleeves, neckline, hat, gloves, and even the trim of your handkerchief. Men's mourning is simpler, a black armband or cravat, maybe a sombre coat. But women's mourning evolves in stages: deep mourning, second mourning, half mourning, each with specific shades of grey and lavender allowed. The rules are so elaborate that you practically need a flowchart to dress yourself. Then comes the funeral itself, a choreography of solemnity. The church is filled with a mixture of genuine sadness and Victorian formality. Hymns echo through the nave, slow, heavy, spiritually nutritious. The vicar speaks of eternity with a tone that suggests he is intimately familiar with the seating arrangements in heaven. Your family sits in the front pew, eyes lowered, hands folded. Your grief is real, but it flows through the narrow channel provided. No wailing, no dramatic fainting, no questions. Outside, the churchyard waits, its leaning headstones and moss-covered markers silently reminding you that life, for all its rules, ends in the same place for everyone. The burial is brief but loaded with symbolism. Earth is sprinkled, verses are read. You stand by the grave with the cold wind tugging at your black sleeves, feeling a mixture of sorrow, fear, love, and resignation. Victorian funerals are not meant to comfort. They are meant to prepare you for your own eventual appointment. Afterward, mourning becomes part of your routine. You adopt a quieter gait, a softer voice, a deliberate lack of visible joy. People greet you with careful sympathy, and you learn to respond with phrases that neither overstate nor understate your despair. Too much cheer suggests callousness. Too much sadness suggests spiritual frailty. Grief must be balanced, like an equation. Church involvement continues, subtly but persistently. You are prayed for publicly. You receive visits from well-meaning parishioners bearing Bible verses and casseroles you didn't ask for. Every Sunday, the empty seat beside you echoes in your mind as the vicar reminds the congregation of life's fragility and heaven's promise. Sometimes the reminders soothe you. Sometimes they make you want to hide under your mourning veil forever. But even with its rigidity, the church gives you something precious: structure, ritual, a path forward through the fog. When your own voice fails, the liturgy steps in. When your grief overwhelms you, the expectations hold you upright. When silence feels unbearable, communal hymns surround you like a soft, steady blanket. Victorian grief is heavy, public, and deeply inconvenient, but it is also shared. You are never allowed to mourn alone. Someone is always watching, yes, but someone is also always present. And in the still moments, standing by the fire in your black dress, or walking slowly home with your gloved hands clasped, you feel a small truth settle gently in your chest. Grief may be governed by rules here, but love is not. And love, quietly and persistently, carries you through. Eventually you grow older. Maybe you marry, move, or simply see enough life to realize that the church rules that shaped your childhood are not carved into the universe in quite the way you were told. You keep some of them: kindness, integrity, the comfort of familiar hymns. Others you quietly set aside. The suffocating guilt over small pleasures, the idea that every question is dangerous, the belief that God is mostly disappointed. To outsiders, your life still looks respectable. You go to church, you raise your children, you say grace at meals. But inside you've edited the script. You allow laughter on Sundays, explanations instead of fear, books that would have horrified your grandparents. The church still hovers over your family, but no longer as an absolute ruler, more like an elderly relative whose stories you respect, even as you decide to live differently. And as your own children start asking their restless, inconvenient questions, you face a new challenge: how to guide them without repeating every rule that once kept you awake at night. The shift happens slowly, almost invisibly. One day you catch yourself humming a lively tune on a Sunday afternoon, something your childhood self would have considered morally treacherous, and realise the world has not cracked open beneath your feet. Another day you choose a book purely because it looks interesting, not because it promises to improve your character. These tiny rebellions accumulate like fallen leaves, individually small, collectively transformative. The church of your youth, the one that felt omnipresent, omniscient and omnipotent, begins to shrink slightly as adult life expands around it. Not because faith becomes unimportant, but because you realize faith is not the same thing as fear. You discover that morality can be guided by empathy rather than anxiety, that holiness might be less about restrictions and more about compassion. Still, you remain part of the community. You attend services, though now you listen not as a rule-following child, but as someone sorting wisdom from habit. You nod at familiar hymns, your heart warming at their melodies even when you question some of the lines. You attend prayer meetings where the same genteel gossip circulates in a loop and you smile gently, knowing the pattern but no longer bound by the urgency of it. Raising your own children becomes a test of your newly rewritten beliefs. They ask questions, big ones, messy ones, the kind that would have made your childhood household's blood pressure skyrocket. Why do we pray like this? Why is that rule important? Does God get mad? What if we don't understand everything? You choose honesty where your parents chose control. You explain instead of warning. You comfort instead of intimidating. You tell them that God is love before you tell them that God is anything else. You reassure them that questions are a sign of thinking, not sin. And sometimes, when the conversation gets too abstract, you simply say, "I don't know either," which feels strangely brave. Of course, not everyone approves. Your mother raises her eyebrows when she sees your children playing outside on a Sunday. Your father sighs dramatically upon discovering a novel on your daughter's shelf that features both romance and humour. Elder church members give you polite but pointed advice about keeping a proper household. You smile, thank them kindly, and continue doing what works for your family. Your home still reflects the faith you were raised in, scripture on the walls, prayer before meals, traditions that anchor you. But the fear is gone. The anxiety has softened. The rules have been trimmed into something livable, breathable. You hold on to what nourishes and quietly retire what wounds. Sometimes, in quieter moments, rocking beside the fire or walking home through the dusky evening, you think of your childhood self. The child who lay awake worrying about whether God approved of their thoughts. The child who sat stiffly in church trying not to break a rule they barely understood. You wish you could go back and whisper to them, "It's okay, it won't always feel like this." And though the church still stands at the centre of your town and its bell still tolls through your window each morning, you hear it differently now. Not as a summons or surveillance, but as part of the familiar soundtrack of your life. Comforting, predictable. No longer the voice telling you who you must be, but a reminder of where you came from. You walk forward with faith, yes, but also with freedom. And in Victorian England, that's quietly revolutionary. And so tonight, as you drift a little closer to sleep, take a slow breath and remember the strange, exhausting, hilariously structured universe you just survived. A Victorian world where every hour rang with a bell, every meal came with a moral performance review, and every choice, from your hat to your hobbies, needed to pass heavenly and neighbourhood inspection. You walked through a day shaped entirely by church rules, where joy required permission slips, romance needed a chaperone, and even laughing too loudly might have caused a doctrinal concern. But through all that structure and scrutiny, there's something quietly remarkable about the people who lived it. They held their families together with discipline and prayer, managed households on tight budgets and tighter expectations, and somehow still found room for kindness, curiosity, and the occasional rebellious thought whispered into a pillow. They carried their fears of sin, scandal, and spiritual failure, alongside an earnest wish to build good lives in a world that gave them very few choices. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your warm bed, a bed that isn't lumpy, isn't stuffed with questionable 19th century feathers, and certainly isn't located in a house where the vicar might appear unannounced, maybe give a small, sleepy nod of gratitude. Gratitude for soft pillows, for privacy, for a world where reading a novel doesn't signal moral collapse, and for the freedom to enjoy a Sunday without worrying that God is taking notes on your posture. Because history, with all its rigid rules and unbelievable expectations, is a reminder of just how stubborn, hopeful, and accidentally hilarious people have always been. They survived endless sermons, impossible standards, confusing wedding nights, and the looming possibility of being gossiped about over tea, and still they kept going. They built families, communities, and little pockets of joy wherever they could fit them. So as your eyes get heavier, let their resilience wrap around you like a soft blanket. Let their struggles remind you how incredibly lucky you are to live in a world with central heating, modern psychology, and zero public bans announcing your business. And may the quiet truth settle in your mind, that even in the strictest times humanity finds ways to laugh, to love, and to rewrite the rules, one imperfect day at a time. Sleep well, rest deeply, and let the past fade softly into dreams.